The case of Kristen Rossum. She could have been a scientist, but she chose a different path. Blonde Kristen Rossum, a chemistry graduate from San Diego State University, could have had a brilliant future. Instead, she is serving a life sentence in the Central California Women's Facility for the crime against her husband. Ralph and Constance Rossum had 3 children and were preparing them for an undoubtedly bright future. The children received education from top schools, were tutored, and participated in clubs and sections for talent development. However, the fragile and impulsive Kristin broke, unable to keep up with the pace and pursuit of the ideal. Lying, skipping classes, and the desire to escape reality first introduced her to a sense of ease and oblivion after consuming alcohol. But soon, alcohol stopped providing the desired effect of tranquility, and she became dependent on the controlled substance methamphetamine. Methamphetamine, meth, is the most addictive illicit substance in the USA. It causes paranoia, clouds judgment, euphoria, and hallucinations. Kristin's erratic behavior and detachment from real life caught her parents' attention. After a long conversation, she admitted that she had been addicted to the substance since high school. This behavior was a severe blow for a family of university-educated professionals. After several months of numerous conflicts with her parents, 17-year-old Kristin secretly ran away to Mexico with friends for a holiday. There, she met a man by chance. Tall, handsome Gregory de Villers, 7 years her senior, seemed like an angel who would save her. And he did. Greg fell in love with the bad girl. He took on the role of a parent and responsibility for her well-being. With Greg's support, she managed to get a job at a local forensic department as a toxicology assistant. Her skills impressed the employer. Her addiction was forgotten, which worked in her favor, as her job in toxicology provided access to seized controlled substances. As a forensic assistant, Kristin graduated from university with honors. Her teachers and employer praised her, handing her the Best Student Award, unaware of the reasons for her love of the chosen profession. Her relationship with Greg lasted about 5 years and ended with a grand wedding on June 5, 1999. Kristin's parents adored Greg and were at ease for their daughter, as she had climbed out of the pit of dependency and confidently stood on the road to a promising and happy life. In March 2000, Kristin was hired by the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office as a toxicologist. A toxicologist analyzes body fluids to detect controlled substances. Gregory was working in the biotechnology industry at the time. Kristin quickly grew bored with her monotonous life and began seeking excitement elsewhere. She found an opportunity with a new colleague, Michael Robertson, who had been appointed as the department head. He was married, but that didn't stop a sudden infatuation between them. They couldn't keep their relationship secret for long. Greg found numerous letters exchanged between the secret lovers. The marital relationship deteriorated, but Gregory still hoped to save the marriage, knowing his wife's weaknesses and trying as hard as ever to save her. This time, Kristin didn't want to be saved. She demanded a divorce. On the morning of Monday, November 6, 2000, Kristin was getting ready for work as usual. Greg was ill and stayed home. Kristin was very worried about her husband. In the days following their separation talk, he had been lethargic and unusually calm. She informed his workplace of her husband's illness. She also visited him during her lunch break. Greg was asleep. At 9:22 p.m. that same day, Christine called emergency services to report that her husband, Greg, was not breathing. He had most likely committed suicide because he was home alone. The woman cried into the phone and did not listen to the dispatcher's instructions to examine the body and possibly administer first aid. Police officers and paramedics arriving on the scene at 10:19 p.m. pronounced Gregory de Villers dead. He was lying on the bedroom floor with his torso exposed, surrounded by scattered rose petals. The room examination suggested that Greg most likely consumed a lethal dose of several controlled substances. Empty vials of powerful painkillers were scattered around, and torn wedding photos were found on his bed. During the interrogation, Kristin stated that she had informed her husband of their separation the previous evening. Just 17 months after the wedding, she regretted getting married. She felt she had rushed into it. Greg was too clingy, and she wanted to distance herself. Greg's death was ruled a suicide. The cause of death was strong sedative drugs. Kristin signed the cremation papers. However, Gregory's family and friends refused to believe in such a sudden suicide. None of them noticed any changes in his character or mood. He had not shared his marital problems with anyone. Greg was so opposed to controlled substances that he would never have taken them. Soon, the relatives managed to stop the cremation and insisted on an independent autopsy. The family's persistence allowed for the consideration of a homicide scenario. Soon, toxicological tests revealed that Gregory's body contained an extremely high amount of fentanyl, a pain reliever 150 times stronger than morphine, along with lesser amounts of clonazepam and trace amounts of oxycodone, known as hillbilly heroin. Investigators speculated that, under the strong influence of clonazepam and other detected drugs, someone else administered the lethal dose of fentanyl to Gregory. Kristin became the prime suspect, as fentanyl is not an over-the-counter medication, and she had ample knowledge and access to such drugs. Upon arrival for interrogation at the police station, Kristin's emaciated, unattractive appearance and her doping behavior indicated her drug dependency. This was confirmed by her own statements on the day of Gregory's death. Kristin was inconsistent in her accounts. Initially, Kristin told paramedics that Gregory had not taken any medication, but later she changed her statement, suggesting he might have taken oxycodone. At the hospital, Kristin told a nurse that Gregory might have overdosed on oxycodone. Oxycodone is similar in effect to codeine-based drugs. It can not only relieve pain, but also induce a sense of euphoria. It depresses the respiratory center, and without timely assistance, its use can be fatal. The police considered the possibility that Gregory died from an accidental overdose of cold medicine and oxycodone. In conversations with Kristin, they also learned that Gregory was very upset about their failing marriage, leading Kristin to tell the police that he ended his own life. This was another investigative avenue they explored. On November 8th, a colleague of Kristin's, Russ Lowe, called the police. He informed them about Kristin's affair with her boss. This information shifted the course of the police investigation. Evidence of Kristin's connection with her boss, Dr. Robertson, was found. The evidence included passionate emails they exchanged, as well as computer files and professional articles revealing Dr. Robertson's specialized knowledge of fentanyl. The criminal puzzle was coming together perfectly. It was suspected that Gregory became a threat to the lovers, as he knew that Kristin, with her access to the lab and controlled substances, was secretly using them, and Michael was covering for her. It was a premeditated crime. The challenge for the investigators was to prove it. During interrogation, Michael Robertson told detectives that he was aware of his lover's drug dependency. At that time, no charges were brought against the couple. They were both dismissed from their jobs for violating several rules during the investigation. Serious trouble for Kristin began in January when police raided her home, finding traces of drugs and paraphernalia. She was arrested for the first time but was later released on bail. The investigation progressed as new information emerged. This included Kristin's diary. During its initial examination, investigators hypothesized that it was written by Kristin not for herself, but for an external reader, as a means of covering up and affirming her innocence while crafting the appearance of Gregory's perfect self-inflicted demise. On the day of her husband's death, she bought a rose in revealing lingerie actions inconsistent with her distressed demeanor. Medical examination indicated that Gregory was unconscious for at least 6 hours before his passing, and his death could have occurred an hour or an hour and a half before it was confirmed. Additionally, a bruise around a needle injection site on the young man's arm was found, its purpose and executor unexplained. At Kristin's workplace, a shortage of the drug that led to Gregory's demise, as well as other controlled substances, was discovered. Police believed Kristin poisoned Gregory, administering fentanyl without his knowledge. The prosecution built its case on toxicological and medical data. With enough circumstantial evidence, Kristin was arrested on June 25, 2001, and charged with first-degree murder. After spending 6 months in custody, she was released on bail. The first trial soon commenced. The prosecution's main theory was the motive for the homicide. They argued that she terminated Gregory because he threatened to tarnish her good girl reputation by revealing her renewed drug use and affair with Michael Robertson. The prosecution claimed Kristin poisoned Gregory with fentanyl. The court heard that fentanyl is a powerful synthetic opioid, 80 times stronger than morphine. It was suggested that she first tried to end his life with clonazepam, but when that failed, she administered fentanyl. They also argued that she then staged the bedroom to look like Gregory ended his own life, tearing pages from her diary and placing rose petals and a wedding photo around his body. The court heard that Kristin, with a degree in biochemistry, used her knowledge of drugs and chemistry to terminate Gregory. The prosecution also claimed that Kristin hoped to convince her colleagues in the medical examiner's office that Gregory's death was self-inflicted, hiding information about the fentanyl. However, before Gregory's autopsy could be conducted, she was transferred to another lab, and the attempt to substitute toxicological research was unsuccessful. The prosecution presented Kristin's day on November 6th. Early in the morning, she called Gregory's employer to report his absence, then went to work. Her colleagues testified that about an hour after she arrived at work, around 9 a.m., she was seen crying in Michael's office. The apartment building manager, where Kristin and Gregory lived, reported seeing her return home at 12:10 p.m. At 12:41 p.m., she went to a local grocery store and purchased several items, including a single red rose. Credit card statements confirm this fact. Hours before Gregory's demise, she made multiple calls to Michael. Dr. Brian Blackburn, the San Diego County medical examiner who conducted Gregory's autopsy, testified that Gregory had been deceased for at least an hour before the paramedics arrived. He informed the court that Gregory developed early bronchopneumonia. This condition arises when secretions, normally expelled through breathing, accumulate in the lungs because a person is either unconscious or not breathing deeply enough. Dr. Blackburn also informed the court that Gregory's bladder contained a significant amount of urine, which would have been very uncomfortable had he been conscious. This led Dr. Blackburn to conclude that Gregory was breathing poorly for approximately 6 to 12 hours before his death. A person in an unconscious state would not be able to sprinkle rose petals over themselves. Dr. Blackburn showed that the level of clonazepam found in Gregory's blood was not at an overdose level and was not lethal. Dr. Theodore Stanley testified on behalf of the prosecution. He demonstrated that fentanyl is a potent and fast-acting pain reliever with a serious side effect that can lead to a person's respiratory arrest. Dr. Stanley stated that the speed at which fentanyl begins to act depends on the method of its administration. The peak effect occurs about 16 hours after applying a transdermal patch, 20 to 30 minutes after oral ingestion, 15 to 20 minutes after intramuscular injection, and within 5 minutes after intravenous injection. Dr. Stanley informed the court that fentanyl is usually not administered orally because the liver destroys about 65% of it, so only 35% enters the bloodstream. When asked to explain how fentanyl entered Gregory's system, neither Dr. Blackburn nor Dr. Stanley could provide a definitive opinion. Dr. Stanley showed that various concentration levels in Gregory's body, along with data indicating that Gregory was unconscious and breathing shallowly for several hours before his death, suggest that fentanyl was likely administered to Gregory multiple times. The prosecution could not confidently tell the jury how Kristin poisoned Gregory, but there were indications that she might have applied fentanyl patches to his arm while he was asleep. The disappearance of 15 patches from the laboratory where Kristin formerly worked supported this theory as a possibility. The defense asserted Kristin's innocence, acknowledging that fentanyl was the cause of Gregory's death, but claimed he self-administered it, intentionally causing his own demise due to despair over family issues. Kristin testified in court, describing waking up on the morning of November 6th to find Gregory distraught. She called his employer at 7:42 a.m. to report his illness and that he wouldn't be coming to work. She told the court she went to work but returned to the apartment to check on Gregory, having lunch with him after noon. Christine's testimony. I asked Gregory why he was so upset that morning. He replied that he wasn't feeling well and had taken some oxycodone and clonazepam. He planned to stay home and sleep. I left for work. Around 2:30 in the afternoon during my lunch break, I came home to check on Gregory. We had lunch. I then went back to work. I got home around 8 o'clock in the evening. Gregory was lying on the bed. I thought he was asleep. I took a bath. When I came out, I tried to wake him up. He was cold. I called the emergency services. The prosecutor cross-examined Kristin, calling her explanation strange. She admitted to lying in the past and about her drug use. He told the court that fentanyl was the perfect poison because it's hard to detect, which she knew well from her job. Medical testimony, based on autopsy and toxicological findings, proved that Gregory was unconscious for about 8 hours, meaning Kristin couldn't have had lunch with her husband that day. The defense claimed that although Dr. Blackburn showed the clomazepam level in Gregory's blood wasn't lethal, taking oxycodone, an opioid, and clomazepam, a benzodiazepine, together could create a synergistic effect, making them more potent. They suggested Gregory might have unknowingly taken the drugs himself. How fentanyl was administered and why high levels were found in his system remained unexplained. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found Kristin guilty of first-degree homicide and special circumstances homicide due to the use of poison. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Kristin maintained her innocence and appealed the verdict. The appellate court heard that errors were made by her own defense team. Her lawyers admitted fentanyl caused the death but failed to test autopsy samples for fentanyl metabolites. This test could have determined whether Gregory swallowed fentanyl or if the fentanyl found in the samples was a result of laboratory contamination after his death. If fentanyl had been detected only in the samples and never in Gregory's body, the prosecution's theory that fentanyl caused his death would have been incorrect. The appellate court heard that there was a break in the chain of custody regarding the samples. They were placed in a cardboard box, with each container marked as a sample from Gregory's body, but the containers weren't sealed. They were supposed to be delivered to the sheriff's office for immediate transfer to an external lab, but the person supposed to receive the samples was absent, so the box remained at the medical examiner's office for about 36 hours before being delivered to the sheriff's forensic lab. The appellate court's argument was that anyone with a key to the medical examiner's office building had access to the samples. Fentanyl could have been added to the samples posthumously. Kristin believed there was a motive to tamper with the samples and frame her for the crime due to various personal relationships and tensions among the staff. Indeed, Kristin argued in the appellate court that on November 8, 2000, Michael informed one of the toxicologists that he had examined a sample of Gregory's stomach contents. The 3-judge panel of the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals concluded that Kristin's lawyers erred in not contesting the prosecution's claim that her husband died from a fentanyl overdose. They stated that her legal team should have tested the autopsy samples for fentanyl metabolites, rather than just admitting he died in such a manner. However, they did not overturn the verdict, but sent the case back to federal court to determine if this defense error could have altered the trial's outcome. After this decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that federal courts must adhere to the state court's decision when considering such appeals. Based on this ruling, the appellate court voted against holding a hearing on Kristin's case. Her appeal was denied, and she remains in custody. Michael Robertson was implicated as an accomplice in Kristin's trial. Authorities discreetly filed a criminal conspiracy complaint and issued a sealed warrant for the arrest of Michael Robertson, the former boss and lover of convicted perpetrator Kristen Rossum. Robertson, who lives freely and works as a forensic toxicology consultant in Australia since Rossum's husband's demise in 2000, could be arrested and held on $100,000 bail if he ever returns to the United States. Gregory's family filed a lawsuit accusing the county of negligence that allowed Kristin to steal a lethal dose of drugs from the medical examiner's office undetected. In 2006, a U.S. court awarded them $147 million in civil damages. In a case that continues to captivate the nation, Rossum, a former toxicologist at the county medical examiner's office, was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in February 2003 for stealing drugs from the lab and using them to poison her husband, Gregory de Villers, staging a suicide scene in their apartment, scattering his body with red rose petals. The tragic story of the Rose family is considered one of the most bizarre and confusing crimes committed in America in recent years. This case struck investigators not only by its cynicism and cruelty, but also by the fact that the victims and the alleged perpetrators were close relatives. Despite the fact that many years have passed since the crime was committed, and the perpetrator has long served his harsh sentence behind bars, there are still many questions and white spots in this story. Many still do not believe in the fairness of the court's verdict. Now let's get down to business. It was an ordinary average family living in a provincial suburb of Bristol in the state of Tennessee and had never been on the radar of law enforcers before. The family was headed by elderly couple Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, who had lived together for over 40 years. They had 2 grown daughters and 6 grandchildren, but we will only look at those family members who were directly involved in this high-profile case. So, at the time of the crime in the house and the surrounding area were the elderly owners themselves, Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, their eldest daughter, 39-year-old Tosha Milhorn with her husband James, and 6 children. 2 of the children were Tosha and James's shared children, while the other 3 children were their heirs from a previous relationship. Also present in the house was a neighborhood girl who stopped by to play with them. It is worth noting that Tosha and James and their children lived at Tosha's parents' house for about 2 months, as their own home was undergoing renovations at the time. Later, another key player in those events, 19-year-old Seth Denton, arrived at the house. He was Toshi's eldest son, but his relationship with his mother and stepfather was strained, to put it mildly, and they avoided communicating with each other in every possible way, and their last meeting ended in tragedy. According to neighbors, the Rose couple was quite happy and prosperous. Their daughter Tosha was also happily married to James, who worked as an auto mechanic and was fond of restoring vintage cars. It was the Rose couple's family home that was the scene of the carnage. Police officers who arrived on the call later dubbed it the worst crime scene they had ever seen and the bloodiest in the history of their quiet county. The bodies of 2 women, Lena Maria and Tosha, a mother and daughter, were found in the house, shot almost point blank. Tosha was in a chair at the dining room table, and her mother was lying on the floor between the table and the refrigerator. Also lying on the doorstep of the house was the critically wounded James, Tosha's husband, who was quickly rushed to the hospital, but despite the efforts of the doctors, the man soon died of extensive internal injuries and massive blood loss. None of the children in the house were injured. It is likely that they were not targeted by the shooter, or were simply not in his field of vision at the time of the massacre of the adults. Almost immediately after the crime, the police received 2 phone calls, one after the other. The first call came from the owner of the house, Curtis Rose, who said that his eldest grandson Seth had committed a shooting in the house and then fled the scene. But soon there was a call from Seth himself, who told a different version of what happened and blamed everything on his grandfather Curtis. In addition, it turned out that Seth was wounded in the arm and shot him Curtis. However, he did not deny it, saying that he was trying to detain his grandson and not let him escape from the scene of the massacre. The alleged killer, Seth Denton, was arrested in the hospital, where he sought medical help in connection with the wound. Then the investigation was to restore the chain of tragic events and find out what really happened in the house of the Rose family. Surprisingly, but for the basis of the investigation was taken only one version, and the second version was taken seriously only a few years later. On August 29, 2015, around 6 o'clock in the evening, residents of houses located near the scene of the crime heard a series of gunshots. No one paid much attention to it, as there were forests around where hunting of wild animals and birds was allowed. Later, one of the neighbors noted that he was a little alarmed by the number of shots, and then the silence, but he did not consider it a good reason to call the police. Another neighbor testified at trial that in addition to the gunshots, he heard screaming and went out on the porch of his house to see what was going on. At that point, he saw a young man running down the path from the neighbor's house to a car parked by the road. He was being chased by another man, but because of the trees by the road, the witness had a poor view of what was happening. He only saw the guy jump into the vehicle, then 2 shots rang out, and then the car sped off. Just a few minutes later, neighbors heard the howling of sirens and saw police cars and emergency vehicles starting to arrive at Rose's house, and soon an air ambulance helicopter landed on the lawn outside the house, arriving to pick up James, who was still alive. Everything that was happening resembled the shooting of some movie, and none of the eyewitnesses did not understand what happened. Arriving police officers were met by the elderly owner of the house, who was holding a firearm, and another gun belonging to him was later found in his bedroom. Curtis told his version of events, which was taken as the basis of the investigation and was long believed to be the only one. According to Curtis, there was nothing to portend trouble that day. In his and his wife's house visited his daughter with his son-in-law and grandchildren, as well as a neighbor's child who came to play. He himself was tinkering in his trailer in the backyard of the house. He heard the sounds of gunshots, but like most neighbors, he didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it was hunters in the woods. Suddenly, his oldest grandson, Seth, appeared at the trailer, arriving unannounced and looking very excited. The young man said there had been some kind of tragedy and asked him to call emergency services immediately. Curtis followed his grandson into the house, where he immediately came across the dead bodies of his wife and daughter. Curtis immediately thought of the children in the house. They were in the other room, frightened, but none of them were hurt. He took them to the back of the house and locked them up so they wouldn't see the horror that was going on in the house. While Curtis was calling emergency services, he saw his grandson hurriedly leaving the house and running toward the road. The homeowner drew his gun and began to chase Seth, believing that he was the killer. As Seth jumped into the car, Grandpa fired 2 shots. One bullet shattered the rear window without hitting the driver, and the second bullet hit Seth in the left shoulder. Despite the injury, he managed to get away, but after reaching the nearest house, Seth stopped to call the police and report what had happened. The local sheriff who was investigating was puzzled. The picture of the crime looked so strange and illogical that similar cases simply did not exist in his memory. In a breaking news report, he said that the investigators had a difficult job ahead of them to reconstruct the whole picture of the crime. After the arrest of Seth Denton, it was necessary to establish the motive why the young man had treated his family members so cruelly, and most surprisingly, such a motive was quickly found. Seth was the eldest child of his mother Toshi, whom she had given birth to in her early youth. Her relationship with the boy's father did not work out, and her son's upbringing was mostly handled by his grandparents, while the young woman settled her personal life. Also, according to some reports, Tosha suffered from bipolar affective disorder and periodically went to the clinic. Most likely, her son could also inherit this disease. Since childhood, the boy had a strong resentment towards his mother, whom he hardly ever saw. With age, this feeling turned into hatred, about which Seth often told friends and relatives. After graduating from school, the guy decided to go to serve in the army, and a year later, returning home, he again settled at his grandparents'. However, soon the young man decided that he wanted to start an independent life and moved to the city, where he rented a small apartment with his friend. He got a job at one of the local fast food restaurants, but shortly before the tragedy, the guy was fired. Family and friends spoke positively about Seth, noting that he never had any violent tendencies, did not run with bad companies, and never broke the law. But despite the positive characteristics, detectives considered that the main motive of the crime was Seth's unpleasant feelings towards his mother and her current spouse. According to the investigation, the events of that day developed as follows. Around 5 p.m., Seth drove his car to the house of his grandparents. He was wearing a camouflage jacket, and in the car lay a semi-automatic rifle. He left the car by the roadside, and with the weapon in hand, he went to the house, entering through the back door. Seth then fired several shots, killing his mother, grandmother, and severely wounding his stepfather, before leaving the jacket and rifle by the back door and going to his grandfather's house and asking him to call the police. The order in which the shots were fired was never determined because Seth completely denied his guilt. In addition, it was unclear why he asked his grandfather to call the police rather than fleeing immediately from the scene of the crime. It is assumed that his main target were his mother and stepfather, and the guy killed his grandmother as an unnecessary witness. As the main evidence proving Seth's guilt, the case included his jacket and rifle. found on the threshold at the back door of the house, traces of blood on his shoes, as well as bullets found in his car. Remarkably, about 100 rounds of ammunition in total were found, but no one questioned why he needed so many if he only planned to kill 2 people. Another oddity was the timing. According to the grandfather, after he and his grandson entered the house, where the terrible picture opened before his eyes, Seth hurriedly left the scene. Curtis himself found and took the children to safety, called the police, pulled out the gun he kept, and after all this, managed to catch up with his grandson and shot him twice. It was not until 2016 that the young man presented his version of what happened in court, which no one had previously considered for some reason. According to Seth, he has always been very close to his grandparents who raised him, but meetings with his mother he avoided by all means. As a teenager, he often went to shooting ranges with his grandfather, and it was his grandfather who encouraged him to join the army. On that fateful day, Seth called his maternal aunt Amanda, his mother's younger sister, and said he was going to visit his grandparents but didn't want to meet his mother there. The woman did not know that Tosha and her husband were visiting her parents, so she assured Seth that he could go without fear of crossing paths with his mother and stepfather. Amanda confirmed that information in court, noting that her nephew couldn't have known that Tosha and James were at Rose's house. Seth had hoped that he and his grandfather would go to the shooting range, and that was the reason he had brought a rifle with so many rounds of ammunition. He drove up to the house, got the gun, and went straight to the trailer where Grandpa usually worked. There, his grandson showed him his rifle, and they had a little discussion about it. Curtis then headed for the house without letting go of the rifle, and his grandson followed him. Seth knew that his grandfather had a gun and expected him to follow him, and afterward they would shoot targets together. However, when Curtis entered the room, he immediately opened fire, and the people in the room did not even have time to realize anything and did not try to run away or hide. According to Seth's lawyers, Curtis may have had a temporary insanity during which he killed members of his family. But this version seemed untenable, so it was not considered initially and marked in court, although on the clothes and shoes of an elderly man also had traces of blood of the victims. He, for some reason from the very beginning, was not even included in the number of suspects. The young man in the dock was facing the capital punishment of death for the premeditated triple murder of his family members. His grandfather had been a key witness in the case from the beginning, and despite the fact that he had openly stated that he was prepared to kill his grandson that day, the court found such behavior justified. Curtis Rose was not taken to the station or questioned as a suspect, and his version of the events of that day was accepted as the only true one. In addition, many details and inconsistencies were simply overlooked, and Seth's version was not even considered until a year and a half after the crime. Most of the physical evidence did confirm Curtis's words, but what was out of the picture was somehow ignored by the investigation. The main argument in court was that Mr. Rose had no obvious motive for killing his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. The version of temporary insanity seemed far-fetched and untenable. The trial lasted more than a week, during which time nearly 200 pieces of evidence were presented and dozens of witnesses, including neighbors, relatives, and family friends, were heard. The grandfather and grandson's testimony completely contradicted each other, and it was obvious that one of them was lying. The jury deliberated for several days. They admitted to being severely exhausted emotionally and physically, but when it came to a verdict, they unanimously stated that they had no doubt that the defendant was guilty of each of the counts charged. Thus, Seth Denton was found guilty of triple murder, but after a detailed review of all the evidence and circumstances of the tragedy, the court decided to exclude the death penalty from the possible punishments, changing the sentence to life imprisonment without the right to parole, at least the next 50 years. The convict himself never admitted his guilt. He is currently serving his sentence in a Tennessee prison. As for the orphaned children of Tosha and James Milhorn, they were left in the care of other family members, including their Aunt Amanda and grandfather Curtis. The case of Matthew Winkler Secrets of a religious family. Sometimes the most horrible and unpredictable crimes are committed in seemingly perfect families. Of course, even in the most prosperous unit of society can come crisis, which will be unnoticed by others, but literally poison the lives of all members of the family and eventually lead to tragedy. The Winklers, in the town of Selmer, were considered by many to be a model family. The young pastor, his wife, and their 3 daughters looked happy, had everything they needed for a comfortable life, were healthy and successful, but in a quiet pool, as they say. In this case, many questions remained unanswered because we heard only one version of what happened, and the story itself became the subject of the book, Sex and Murder: Secrets of a Pastor. March 22nd, 2006, the small town of Selmer, Tennessee, shook the terrible news. A 31-year-old pastor named Matthew Winkler was brutally murdered in his own home, and his wife Mary and their 3 daughters, 8-year-old Patricia, 6-year-old Maria Eliza, and 1-year-old Brianna disappeared without a trace. That day, the preacher of the Church of Christ did not show up for the evening service where he was supposed to attend with his family. This circumstance seemed strange and suspicious, because Matthew was always very responsible and could not miss the planned event without informing anyone. None of the family members also answered the phone, which was even more disturbing. Alarmed community members decided to go to the Winklers' residence to find out what had happened and if they needed help. From the outside, the house looked normal. The windows and doors were intact, and nothing suspicious was visible. Inside, there were lights on in several rooms, and they could hear a television playing quite loudly in one of the rooms. It gave the impression that the owners of the house were busy doing their own thing. The front door was locked, but no one answered the knock. Phone calls also went unanswered, and through the curtained windows, it was impossible to see what was going on inside or if anyone was there. However, even though the whole situation was quite strange, no one was in a hurry to call the police. Instead, a call was made to an elder of the religious community who advised them to look for a spare key and open the door themselves. It took another hour and a half, and when members of the community were finally able to get inside the house, they found an eerie scene. Everything in the house was in its place. There was no sign of intruders, but the owners were nowhere to be seen either. Everything seemed normal until the visitors looked into the marital bedroom. There on the floor, in a pool of his own blood, lay the pastor's body. There was a huge hole in his back from a gunshot wound. Blood spattered everywhere, and bloody foam dried on his face. By then, the body had already cooled and stiffened. It was obvious that Matthew had been lying there for many hours and had probably been killed in the morning because he was dressed in his pajamas. It was only after this that a call was made to the police. By the time the police arrived, a whole crowd of neighbors, churchgoers, and casual passers-by had gathered in and around the house, interested in what was going on. All of these people had left their fingerprints at the crime scene. They left their fingerprints and shoe prints, erased or trampled possible evidence, greatly complicating the work of investigators. The police took the body for forensic examination and found that the pastor was killed by a single shot in the back, fired from a large caliber weapon. He died a few minutes after the wound, from massive blood loss, unable to call for help. It was simply impossible to establish definitively whether there were any strangers in the house at that time, because the people who had arrived before the police arrived had literally destroyed all traces of them. The picture of the crime was quite strange, and those who could shed any light on what happened disappeared. The fate of the wife and daughters of the murdered man remained unknown. The police assumed that the women and children could have been kidnapped or also killed. By the way, the family minivan Winklers also disappeared from the garage. A massive search was launched and the state issued a yellow alert. This meant that children were missing, and all citizens were asked to be vigilant and assist in the search. But let's break this whole story down from the beginning. Matthew Brian Winkler was born in 1974, November 21st, in the picturesque country town of Henderson, Tennessee, and was the youngest of 3 sons of Dan and Diane Winkler. Our hero and his 2 older brothers, James and Daniel, grew up in a rather conservative Christian family. Their parents were very religious and brought up their sons in strictness and obedience. It is worth noting that Matthew became a minister of the church in the 5th generation. His father, great-uncle Michael, grandfather Wendell, great-grandfather Merlin Winkler, and great-great-grandfather Merlin Paul Winkler Sr. were all preachers of the gospel at one time. The father, to top it all off, ran the local preacher's school and was a man respected and influential in his hometown. In their younger years, the Winkler brothers attended Sunday school and were active in church activities. In addition, Matthew in high school was seriously interested in soccer, and everyone who saw his game on the field noted that he had talent and he could well become an outstanding athlete of world renown. However, later the young man decided to sacrifice a promising sports career in favor of Bible study and church ministry. Since the preaching activity of the head of the family was associated with frequent travel, his wife and children almost always followed him. Because of this, Matthew changed several schools in his childhood, but the active, communicative, and friendly child quickly made friends and gained authority everywhere. When the boy finished school, his family lived in a small city called Austin, located in the state of Texas. Matthew was a creative person, had a powerful charisma, but here are some outstanding achievements in studies could not boast. After graduating from high school, he entered the college Fried Hardeman and successfully completed it. In parallel, the young man began to try his hand as a pastor, under the careful guidance of his father. Matthew was the youth minister of the Central Church of Christ in the city of McMinnville. He was later appointed to the preaching position at the 4th Street Church of Christ in Selmer, Tennessee. Mary Carol Winkler, maiden name Freeman, was born in December 1973 in Geist Township, Tennessee, and was the oldest of 2 daughters to her parents. She was also raised in a deeply religious family with strict rules. The head of the family for many years served as a pastor in the Christian church, where the girl attended Sunday school. A few years later, a second daughter was born to the family and named Patricia. Unfortunately, the girl was born prematurely and had a number of serious health problems, including cerebral palsy, encephalitis, epilepsy, and mental retardation. For many years, the parents did not want to put up with the disappointing diagnoses of the child and desperately tried to treat her, agreeing even to experimental therapy. However, it did not bring any particular improvement. Mary tenderly loved her little sister, always treated her with awe and cared for her as best she could. But in 1987, when 10-year-old Patricia was bathing in the bathtub, her older sister was only a minute away to take something from the bathing accessories, and at that very moment, the girl had another epileptic seizure. When Mary returned to the room, her sister was no longer breathing, and all attempts to resuscitate her had come to nothing. For a 13-year-old girl, it was a huge shock and the first loss in her life. She blamed herself for the tragedy and was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Teachers who saw the deplorable state of Mary sent her to the school psychologist, working with whom she helped. But her father, learning about what was happening, made a scandal and forbade his daughter to go to these sessions, saying that such problems are discussed only within the family. In fact, the girl never received real moral support from her parents. Mary grew up modest and quite shy. She tried to avoid any conflicts, and after the tragic death of her little sister, she became withdrawn. Since her father did not allow her to seek help from a specialist, the trauma over the years has resulted in serious psychological problems. After the death of Patricia, the parents decided to adopt a little girl named Charlotte, who was from a dysfunctional large family. Soon the couple was also allowed to take custody of Charlotte's 2 brothers and sister, so the family was reunited in their new home. Mary was once again the older sister and took care of the younger children while helping her mother. Matthew and Mary Winkler, family life. The future spouses met soon after Matthew graduated from high school. The guy was prominent, handsome, athletic, and enjoyed great popularity with the opposite sex, but to spin novels right and left, he did not allow a strict religious upbringing. The young people immediately developed a liking for each other, which quickly grew into love. For both of them, it was the first strong feeling in their lives, and after a couple of months they met each other's parents, and having received their blessing, began to plan a wedding. In April 1994, the lovers got married. When the family had an older daughter, Patricia, the head of the family was still in college and was forced to leave school for a while. He took a job at a construction site, but long there did not last, because he was not used to hard physical labor. During this period, for the first time, made himself aware of the difficult character of Matthew. He was often angry with others, irritated at small things, and sometimes he could not control his anger. But Mary tried not to complain and not to tell anyone about what was happening in her family. A meek young woman, brought up in the spirit of patriarchy, obeyed her husband in everything. At first, the Winklers lived near the house of Mary's parents, so she was able to see them regularly. But soon Mrs. Freeman was diagnosed with cancer, which rapidly progressed, and in just a few months, she literally burned from the disease. It was another shock for Mary, and the care of her underage siblings now fell on her shoulders. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Mary was pregnant again at that time. But soon after the birth of their second daughter, the family moved to another city, where they bought their own small house. After the move, Mary was completely absorbed in the care of the baby, and almost stopped communicating with her father, as well as with younger brothers and sisters, who were too demanding and constantly needed attention. In addition, the young mother began to suffer from severe postpartum depression. Everyone who was closely acquainted with the family Winkler noted some oddities in the character and behavior of Mary. The young woman was characterized as an introvert and even sociophobic. She did not communicate with anyone. It was difficult for her to make new acquaintances, much less friendships. She suffered from mood swings, was prone to melancholy, and any little thing could bring her to tears. While Matthew was building his career as a pastor, his wife became increasingly withdrawn. The situation became even more complicated when Mary once again became pregnant, and a few months later, she learned that the fetus had died in her womb. Such news strongly shook Mary, who was looking forward to the appearance of this child and very much dreamed of a large, friendly family. Again, to see the long-awaited 2 stripes on the pregnancy test she could only 2 years later, and her happiness was unbounded. This time, Mary hid her pregnancy for a long time, as if afraid of something. She did so until her situation became obvious. Once again, everyone began to talk about Mary's strange behavior and pathological reticence. The strange behavior of Mrs. Winkler was associated not only with a severe psychological trauma she suffered in childhood, but also with a very unhealthy environment within her own family, which only undermined her already unstable nervous system. The head of the family was a man of authority and demanded unconditional obedience. Despite the fact that in public the Winklers looked like an ideal married couple, where there was trust, mutual respect, and harmony, in reality, their neighbors have repeatedly heard how the husband shouted and snapped at his wife for no apparent reason. No one could even imagine that a respected pastor could raise a hand on his wife until one day Mary had a huge black eye. Despite the fact that she denied the fact of domestic violence and said that it was an accident, the city quickly spread rumors about the cruelty of a young creature who beats the mother of his children. In addition, Matthew at some point developed an irresistible urge to experiment in bed. He offered his wife to diversify their intimate life with role-playing games, adult toys, and so on. But for Mary, brought up in strictness with conservative views, such was unacceptable. She strongly restricted her husband in this, which infuriated him, and he repeatedly tried to get what he wanted by force. One day, after another abuse in bed, Mary called her only close friend in tears and complained to her about the situation. The friend, who promised to keep her secret, immediately blabbed about everything, which provoked a new wave of rumors and gossip about the unacceptable behavior of the clergyman. At that time, Matthew was up for promotion and aspired to be a local church leader, but he was rejected because of rapidly spreading unpleasant rumors about him. Moreover, he was also removed from his position in the Sunday school, where he had brought God's word to the children and was in good standing. This was requested by the parents, who had also heard about the pastor's peculiar predilections. All this forced the family to leave their residence and move to another city where they planned to start over. They settled in Silmer, where they quickly gained the love and respect of those around them. Matthew took a job as a church pastor again, and his wife found a part-time job to make a small contribution to the family income. And although the family was still not smooth, their neighbors, as well as the congregation of the church where Matthew preached, considered Mary and Matthew an ideal couple, and their family a model. Next door to the Winkler family lived a young married couple, with whom the couple quickly became friends. They often visited each other, celebrated holidays together, shared news and secrets. A few months before the tragedy, during a joint dinner at the pastor's house, Mary bragged to the neighbors that her husband had bought her a gun for self-defense and had already taken her to the shooting range several times to learn how to handle it confidently. Mary turned out to be quite a capable student, quickly mastered all the subtleties, and accurately shot at targets. Moreover, it turned out that the Winklers already had firearms in the house, which had been purchased by the pastor earlier, also for self-defense. The guests wondered why the pastor and his wife needed all this, because they live in a quiet town where they have no enemies, and everyone around them loves and respects their family. After another move of the couple, their financial situation left much to be desired. Mary was in search of various part-time jobs, and she also decided to get a medical degree to then get a job in a clinic and help sick children. Soon, Mary decided to improve the financial condition of their family through financial fraud. She herself later claimed that she did not realize that she was doing something illegal and was going to pay back all the money as soon as she got back on her feet. What Mary was doing is commonly referred to as artificially inflating account balances. Mrs. Winkler also received checks from unspecified sources and then deposited them into a bank account she and her husband owned. She then changed the address of the account so that all communications would be routed there. The total amount of checks she received was almost $17,000, which aroused certain suspicions of the bank employees who decided to invite the couple to the office branch to clarify the circumstances and resolve the situation. But the pastor and his wife never showed up at the bank, and this aroused even more suspicion. It was assumed that Matthew was not aware of what his wife was doing at all. However, after Matthew's death, his wife tried to prove in court that the whole story of fraud was his idea, and that it was he who forced her to make dubious transactions, while he himself remained in the shadows, without arousing suspicion. Where has Mary disappeared to? When Mr. Winkler was found murdered in his own home, his wife and daughters were put on the wanted list, fearing that they too might be in mortal danger. Initially, the meek, shy, and homely Mary was initially viewed solely as a possible victim of the crime. However, after talking to neighbors and receiving information from the bank about financial fraud, she became the main suspect in the murder of her own husband. It was necessary to find out as soon as possible where Mary had disappeared to, where the children were, and if they were all right. They, as well as their family car, were put on the wanted list. Attempts were also made to trace transactions made for Mary's bank card and to locate her location through her cell phone signal. Mary was found just a day later in an Alabama resort town where she and her children were having fun at a local amusement park. It was as if the mother wanted to give her children one last party, realizing that she would soon be going to prison and would see her girls very soon. When the family was taken to the police station to testify, the two older daughters confidently told the same story. According to them, intruders broke into the house and injured their dad, and their mom picked up a gun to protect them. They were then forced to run for their lives. According to the girls, their father was alive and in the hospital, and they were soon to go and see him and return home. What exactly happened in the house, as it turned out, Patricia and Maria Eliza did not see, and learned about the events from the words of their mother. They only heard a gunshot and glimpsed their father lying on the floor, and then their mother put them in the car, and they drove away. Mary almost immediately began to confess, but she claimed that she could not reconstruct the entire chain of events of that day, referring to the temporary blur. According to her, her spouse had abused her for years, humiliating her and inducing her to forms of intimacy that were unacceptable to her. Mary insisted that it was he who had initiated the financial scam she had perpetrated. Matthew demanded total obedience, easily lost his temper, and once gave the will of his fists. This was confirmed by Matthew's secretary at his previous place of employment. The woman repeatedly witnessed how the pastor insulted his wife, who carefully brought him lunch to church, but he was always dissatisfied with something. The evening before the tragedy, there was another scandal in the family, because of which the spouses went to bed in separate rooms. Mary cried all night, and in the morning she did not realize how in her hands was a shotgun, which her husband kept loaded. She entered Matthew's room and shot him in the back while he was still lying in bed. Matthew collapsed to the floor, bloody foam oozing from his mouth and nose. According to Mary, her husband, while still alive, whispered, "Why?" To which she replied, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Mary then took her daughters and left the house, and her husband, as experts have established, tried to reach for the phone to call for help, but he no longer had the strength to do so. By the way, the weapon of crime was found in the trunk of the car on which Mary left with the children. For what purpose she took it with her, Mrs. Winkler also could not answer. At the trial, the role-playing costumes found in their home were presented as evidence of the pastor's humiliation and moral abuse of his wife. Upon seeing them, Mary turned pale and then became hysterical. Despite the fact that she confused her testimony and told several different versions of what happened, the court agreed that she was the victim of a domestic tyrant, and the murder was the result of years of anger, resentment, and pain. However, this did not absolve Mary of responsibility for what she had done. In April 2007, the court delivered its final verdict in this complicated and confusing case. Mrs. Winkler was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, but her mental state raised many questions. It was originally expected that the young woman would be sent to prison for at least 6 years, but in the end, she was given a sentence of less than 1 year. She spent 2 months of that sentence in a psychiatric hospital, where experts were trying to determine whether she could regain custody of her children upon release. In the summer of 2008, Mary was given sole custody of her daughters, who all this time lived with their paternal grandparents. Matthew's parents were extremely upset by this circumstance. They believed that their daughter-in-law had deliberately killed their son and suffered virtually no punishment for it, and now their granddaughters were given full custody of her. However, all their numerous attempts to file appeals had failed. As for the fraud case, it never went to trial. The bank never filed formal charges, and the whole story was dropped. The case of Jennifer Sabina. Why did a loving husband mutilate his wife? Many of us have heard repeatedly of the severe psychological condition known as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but few have thought about what lies behind those 3 words. The term is used to describe mental disorders that result from a single or repeated encounter with a severe traumatic event: violence, accidents, disasters, war, etc. This type of disorder is often found in military personnel, people who have been involved in combat and witnessed the deaths of others over a long period of time. Even after returning home, they have a hard time adjusting to civilian life. According to a report by the World Health Organization, 1/3 of soldiers returning from conflict zones experience some degree of PTSD. Most tragically, their loved ones suffer as well, desperately trying to help them overcome the crisis and get their lives back on track. The family of Benjamin Sabina, an Iraq War veteran, struggled with this problem for years. Unfortunately, the disease proved to be insurmountable. Jennifer Sabina's case shocked the quiet town of Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, with its brutality. Moreover, it was the first case of a police officer killed in the line of duty in the town's history. Behind it, all was a tragic story that spanned nearly a decade and culminated in the death of a young woman. Let's start at the beginning to make sense of the situation and try to determine if there was a chance to avoid such a dramatic denouement. Jennifer and Benjamin Sabina. Before they met, Jennifer Louise Sabina, née Miller, was born in 1982 in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. She was the oldest of 2 children in her family and grew up with her younger brother Jacob, with whom she always kept in close touch. When Jennifer went to school, her parents decided to separate and filed for divorce, after which her father moved to another state and stopped playing any role in his children's lives. Her mother had to work hard to provide for the children, but Jennifer was always her main helper and support. She kept the house in order, cooked meals, and took care of her younger brother while their mother worked tirelessly. In addition, Jennifer excelled in school and dreamed of a future career in law enforcement. Benjamin J. Sabina, also a Milwaukee native, was Jennifer's age and even attended the same school as her. However, despite this coincidence, they did not know each other personally. After high school, Benjamin joined the U.S. Marine Corps and served 2 tours of duty in Iraq. He was honorably discharged in 2005 after suffering a severe concussion and numerous injuries to his body and limbs. The story of how the couple met. While serving in Iraq, Benjamin registered on the newly emerging and rapidly growing social networking site, Facebook. There he searched for his hometown, and while browsing the profiles of fellow citizens, came across the profile of a charming, smiling girl named Jennifer. After researching her information, he realized that they had once attended the same high school, but he couldn't remember her. After thinking for a bit, Sabina decided to approach the pretty girl. He greeted her, told her that he was currently serving in Iraq in the Marine Corps, and asked how she was doing. Jennifer didn't respond right away and briefly wrote that she was doing well. It was obvious that she was not eager to correspond with a stranger, but the young man was not confused. Benjamin began to write to her daily, even if she did not respond. Gradually, he managed to capture the attention of the beauty, and they began to chat casually on various topics, remembering the school where they once studied together, and trying to understand how they had not met before. A mutual liking developed between them, and they even started planning a reunion when Benjamin could come home. By then, Jennifer had graduated from the police academy, received specialized training, and after successfully passing all of her exams, became a police officer in her hometown of Wauwatosa, Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. It was her dream job since her high school years, and she was incredibly proud of it. Jennifer emotionally shared her joy with a pen pal who sincerely congratulated her on this accomplishment. Severe injury and return home. Benjamin was supposed to return home in November 2005, but in February of that year, he and several of his comrades were hit by mortar fire. Almost all of Benjamin's comrades were killed that day, and he miraculously survived but was severely wounded. His kneecap was nearly shattered, his left arm was nearly torn off by shrapnel and held together by only a few tendons and a piece of skin, and he suffered shrapnel wounds to his chest, head, and a severe concussion. The Marine was taken to a military hospital where he was painstakingly picked up piece by piece, and when his condition stabilized, transferred to Germany for treatment and rehabilitation. His arm was saved, although it had partially lost sensation and function, but his knee was in much worse condition. Doctors were inclined to believe that Benjamin was unlikely to be able to get back on his feet again. During this time, Jennifer, with whom he corresponded daily, was very supportive and encouraging. She said that she was constantly praying for his recovery, believing in a miracle and hoping for the best. The miracle did happen, and gradually, Sabina began to recover, relearning to walk. A few months later, the demobilized Marine was sent to California, where his military unit was based. After completing the necessary paperwork, he returned to his hometown of Wauwatosa as a combat veteran and disabled veteran, where his parents and Jennifer, with whom he had become very close through correspondence, were waiting for him. By then, Benjamin was continuing his rehabilitation program, which was yielding good results. The muscles of his damaged limbs recovered and became stronger. He started to exercise and soon was able to use his left arm normally and, contrary to the doctor's predictions, began to walk and even run. As soon as they met Jennifer for the first time, they realized that they didn't want to part for a day. The couple spent all their time together, talked about everything in the world, and it seemed that they had known each other all their lives. Between the young people began and rapidly developed a passionate romance. Jennifer considered her lover a hero, surrounded him with care, and supported him in everything. Benjamin was very grateful to her for this, and at the end of 2005, he offered to make her his lawful wife, to which she happily agreed. They did not delay in registering their marriage and got married on New Year's Eve 2006. Severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The time spent by the young man in war zones did not pass without a trace, leaving him not only scars, but also a deep psychological trauma. Benjamin suffered from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with all the typical symptoms, including nightmares, increased anxiety, psychotic experiences, known as flashbacks, depression, and thoughts of self-harm. For the former Marine, any loud noise, popping, fireworks, or even the sound of a passing airplane could trigger memories of his horrific experiences. He regularly underwent therapy, worked with specialists, and there were times when the disorder receded so much that his loved ones thought that he returned to normal life, but this impression was deceptive. According to Benjamin's own recollections, during the war years, he witnessed the deaths of at least 50 of his comrades, many of whom were close to him, and their loss was felt as a personal grief. Jennifer and Ben attended church together, where the man also sought help in overcoming the psychological problems he faced. A combination of different therapeutic approaches, medical and spiritual, proved effective. Recovery seemed close at hand, but some symptoms appeared to have become chronic. Because Jennifer and Benjamin were still young and full of hope and plans, they decided to postpone having children until his condition stabilized. The couple believed that they had their whole lives ahead of them and that they still had time for everything. However, 7 years after the wedding, Benjamin's condition had not improved. He was still plagued by nightmares, panic attacks, and thoughts of self-harm. Moreover, due to his injuries and disorders, the former Marine was not only forced to give up his military career, but was also unable to get another prestigious and promising job. Warning signs. In 2012, 7 years into rehab, all the progress Benjamin had made over the years began to rapidly deteriorate. In October, Jennifer confided to her best friend Linda that her husband had acquired a gun that he hardly ever parted with and even slept with it under his pillow. At night, he would often wake up with nightmares, screaming, grabbing the gun, unable to realize where he was, and feeling as if he were still at war, surrounded by enemies. At times like these, his wife would try to do her best to calm him down and bring him back to reality. These nightmare episodes became regular, and the sedatives prescribed by the doctor hardly helped. Moreover, Benjamin began to have thoughts of voluntarily ending his life, which he shared with his wife. In an attempt to reassure him, she told him that she could not live without him and would follow him in his care. By then, both spouses were in their 30s. Jennifer had a promising job, was respected at work, had many friends, and was adored by those around her. Benjamin had only a government-appointed disability pension. He socialized only with close relatives and parishioners, as the couple attended church services regularly. He had almost no friends, as people avoided and feared him because of his strange behavior and occasional bouts of aggression. Probably in addition to PTSD and depression, Benjamin was experiencing an impending midlife crisis. It seemed to him that everyone around him was moving forward, striving for something and achieving something, except for himself. Even his wife's care and support began to seem like a mockery to him, and he was tormented by feelings of guilt and shame for his own inferiority. In early December 2012, Jennifer was transferred to night shifts. She now patrolled the streets of Wauwatosa from dusk to dawn, maintaining order. She was very worried about this because her husband would be alone at night, and if he had another nightmare or memory, there would be no one to help him. As their 7th wedding anniversary approached, Jennifer was thinking of taking a vacation, planning a trip to the ocean for a change of scenery and relaxation. On December 17th, she shared these plans with a colleague, but these plans were not destined to come true because a week later there was a terrible tragedy that cut short the life of a young woman, a tragic incident in a quiet town. On the evening of December 23, 2012, just before Christmas, Jennifer came in for the night shift. Throughout her shift, she texted her husband constantly, worried about his condition. Toward dawn, the messages from Jennifer stopped, although her husband continued to text her asking if everything was okay. Early in the morning, at 5 o'clock, the dispatcher tried several times to contact Jennifer, but when the patrolman did not respond, he decided to track down the location of the squad car Jennifer was using. The car was found at the city's fire station, located just 5 minutes from the police department. Patrol officers often stopped by here to grab a bite to eat or write a report at the end of their shift. However, the officer was still unresponsive, which caused serious concern because it had never happened before. Dispatch sent another officer from the station to the fire station, where a horrible discovery awaited him. Jennifer's squad car was parked at the back door of the building, and just a few feet away, right by the exit, Jennifer lay lifeless on the snow-covered pavement in a pool of blood. She had suffered multiple gunshot wounds to the head at close range, and her face was virtually unrecognizable. The officer immediately reported the incident to the station, from where an investigation team was dispatched to the scene, as well as a medical team. Thus, on the night before Christmas, Officer Jennifer Sabina became the first police officer in the history of the quiet town to be fatally wounded in the line of duty. Suspicious widower. Around 6:30 a.m., Benjamin called the police station, inquiring how his wife was doing and why her phone was not answering. He was told that there had been an incident with Jennifer, without giving details, and was asked to come to the station immediately. He arrived less than half an hour later, looking anxious, but strangely, asking no questions. Benjamin didn't try to find out what had happened to his wife, whether she was hurt, or if she was even alive. He answered a few standard questions, telling what had happened the night before and where he had been while his wife was on duty. According to Benjamin, after his wife left, he went to the store briefly and spent the rest of the evening and night at home playing video games and texting Jennifer until she suddenly stopped responding. In the morning, he called the station and was asked to come in. At the time, he could not be charged, only questioned, standard procedure. However, the police noted fresh abrasions on his hands and dried blood on them. In response, Benjamin said he struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder and that pain often helps him come to his senses. When the former Marine was finally informed that his wife had been fatally wounded, he had a real breakdown. He jumped up, shouting that it couldn't be true, knocked over a table, and began pounding his fists on the wall. It took several strong officers to subdue and calm the distraught widower. Case investigation. At the crime scene, in the freshly fallen snow, there was only one set of footprints leading from the tire tracks to the back door of the fire station and back. This suggested that the perpetrator was alone, and based on the size of the footprints, it was an adult male. Ballistics analysis yielded even more intriguing results. 5 bullets were fired at the officer from 2 different weapons, the first from a 9mm handgun and the second from Jennifer's service weapon, which the perpetrator had taken with him. All of the bullets were aimed at the head, 2 in the back of the head and 3 in the face, indicating personal animosity, deep hostility, or a desire for revenge. However, the young woman had no enemies. Everyone who knew her personally loved and respected her, speaking of her only favorably. On the same day, footage from all the street surveillance cameras leading to the fire station was requested. As it turned out, there were virtually no cars on the roads of the small town in the wee hours of the morning. However, around 4 a.m., a black Toyota Prius with tinted windows and black rims pulled up to the fire station. At some point, the car disappeared from camera view, and a short time later, the same car was seen traveling in the opposite direction, heading directly towards Sabin's home. It is noteworthy that Benjamin arrived at the police station that morning in the same car for questioning, which removes all doubt. He was immediately followed, arrested as the prime suspect, and his house was thoroughly searched. The first thing investigators noticed was the holes in the living room wall. The drywall had been punctured, apparently by fists, and bloodstains were visible around the edges. It became clear that this was where Benjamin had gotten the abrasions on his hands, and it had happened no later than the night before. On the refrigerator door were colorful sticky notes that the couple used to leave messages for each other. If Jennifer's notes radiated love and care, her husband's were either dry and one-worded or so insincere that they seemed like quotes from romance novels. A shell casing from a 9mm pistol was discovered in one of the dresser drawers, and the weapon itself was soon found in the bedroom, in the bedside table on the side where her husband slept. The search for Jennifer's stolen service weapon took the police a lot of time and effort, but eventually the gun was found in a ventilation duct under the ceiling. Forensics confirmed that it was indeed the weapon used to shoot Jennifer. Benjamin's version. At first, after his arrest, Benjamin stuck to his original statement, claiming that he had not left the house and denying his involvement in his wife's death, insisting that he loved her and could not have hurt her. However, when he was presented with irrefutable evidence of his guilt, he began to sob and testify. He revealed that he had suffered from various manifestations of post-traumatic stress disorder for years after returning from the war zone. Neither the love and care of his wife nor his church nor experienced doctors could help him. Recently, he had been thinking more and more about voluntarily ending his life. and he shared this thought with his wife. However, she persistently discouraged him, claiming that she could not live without him and would follow him. It is alleged that Ben decided to dispose of his lover out of mercy. He reasoned that they were both religious people, and if Jennifer took her own life, it would be a grave sin leading the soul to eternal damnation. So he decided to spare his beloved from eternal suffering and take all the burden by ending her life and then ending his own. Benjamin knew that his wife, like her co-workers, stopped by the firehouse at the end of her shift to write a report. He watched her for days to make sure, to find out the exact time and place where she parked her car. That fateful evening, he arrived on time, about 15 minutes before his wife got out. He waited for her right at the door, acting quickly and decisively, firing 2 shots to the head with a pistol he had brought from home. Then, he claims, she turned around, drew her service weapon, which he had taken from her, and fired 3 more shots to the head. However, it was the expert's opinion that the first 2 shots to the head were fatal and that she was unable to turn around or reach for the gun. Moreover, the entry wounds indicated that the last 3 shots were fired into her body while she was lying on the ground. In addition, it was unclear why Ben shot her 5 times in the head, substantially disfiguring her face, necessitating a closed casket funeral. Trial and sentencing. In the end, Benjamin fully pleaded guilty, but attributed his actions to a severe mental disorder, stating that he was not aware of his actions. As a result, a psychiatric evaluation was ordered, which showed that although the man suffered from severe complex post-traumatic stress disorder, he was fully aware of what he was doing. Moreover, Sabina had planned the crime in advance, subsequently tried to cover his tracks and hide evidence, and continued to send messages to his now deceased wife's cell phone to avert suspicion. Witnesses, including friends and co-workers of the deceased, testified that the husband was jealous of his wife's career success and often took it out on her. In addition, Benjamin was insanely jealous of Jennifer's male co-workers. He believed that his wife could leave him at any time because she is surrounded by young, healthy men who do not have the physical and psychological problems that he had. His jealousy and suspicion, compounded by his anxiety, drove her to despair. Sabina appeared in court in a wheelchair, bound hand and foot because of his constant attempts to harm himself. He fully pleaded guilty, cried, apologized to his mother-in-law, and stated that if he could turn back time, he would never hurt the woman who loved him and whom he loved. In June 2013, Benjamin was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder despite serious mental health issues. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. Jennifer's mother stated in court that she forgave her son-in-law and left his fate in the hands of God. The defendant's mother testified that her son returned from military service a completely different person, deeply distressed both physically and mentally, broken and lost. She and her daughter-in-law tried desperately to help him, but the darkness in his soul was overwhelming. In addition, the case of Officer Jennifer Sabina's death subsequently sparked a heated debate over whether her name should be included on a Washington memorial honoring law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty. Initially, the decision was made to exclude her name because of the nature of her death. However, after significant protests and collective petitions from Wisconsin residents, her name was eventually added to the memorial wall. There are crimes that at first glance are difficult to assess unambiguously. On the one hand, the law of any state guarantees the inviolability of life and health of every person. In contrast, it is often opposed by the testimony of witnesses who minimize the guilt of the attacker. One such controversial case was the crime that occurred in the Mullenix family. Let's try to make sense of it together. Let's find out the reasons for the tension and weigh the responsibility of each person involved. Could it be that the victim is far from innocent? Or is her executioner a wolf in sheep's clothing, an unexpected discovery? On September 14, 2006, Newport Beach was troubled. A woman's body was discovered in a body of water. Apparently, the corpse had been wrapped in a sheet and then placed in a box. When exposed to the water, the unreliable wrapping fell apart and exposed what should have been hidden from view. The body floated to the surface after being in the water for no more than a day. Normally, warm water would speed up the decomposition process. Therefore, the appearance of the dead left much to be desired. Forensic medical examination established the cause of the woman's death was multiple stab wounds. In total, she received about 52 blows, one of which came directly to the eye. Specialists agreed that the injuries were caused by 3 different knives, which means there were at least 2 people who attacked the victim. Naturally, the victim had no identification on her, so the police had to work hard to find out her identity. Among the missing, the profile of the woman was not listed, and no new disappearances have been reported so far. Everything pointed to attempts to cover up the crime committed. Experts also determined that the woman had resorted to plastic surgery during her lifetime. She had breast augmentation. Since the identification of bodies by serial number of implants became a routine procedure, the identity of the murdered was soon established. She was 56-year-old Barbara Mullenix. Who is Barbara Mullenix? The future Mrs. Mullenix was born on May 29, 1950 in Munich, Germany. In her youth, she was very beautiful and sociable. Therefore, she was always in the center of attention. However, these qualities brought her not only success with the opposite sex, but also caused her a lot of trouble. At the age of 18, she was subjected to violence. The girl wanted to forget as quickly as possible what happened, but after a while she learned about the pregnancy. To make an abortion Barbara did not become, she decided to bear the child and give it to a good family. After a while, she got married. In the marriage, she gave birth to a son, Alex Hagwood. However, the marital relationship with her first husband did not last long. At the age of 35, Barbara's attention was attracted by Bruce Mullenix. The man recalled that she was a special woman and immediately liked him. She was characterized by straightforwardness and self-confidence. In November 1987, the couple married. Mr. Mullenix was younger than his wife for 9 years, but it was not particularly felt. Barbara knew how to arouse interest and liked to have fun. After moving to Oklahoma City, a daughter, Rachel, was born to the family. Everything was fine at first, but as time went on, problems began. In the evenings, Bruce could skip on a mug of beer, and on weekends to drop in on friends. Barbara at first supported the company, but later became addicted to alcohol. Apparently, the events that occurred in her youth left their imprint. Under the influence of alcohol, the woman, despite the parents' relationship with each other, they loved their daughter very much. They spoiled her and tried to please her in every way. While living in Oklahoma, before the divorce, Rachel had a large room while her father and mother lived in a small one. On the occasion of the girls' birthday parties were always held in the house. Miss Mullenix recalled that she was very close to her mother, even more so than most mothers and daughters. But such a close bond existed only when the woman was sober. The rest of the time, Rachel tried to stay away from her, made no attempt to even talk to her. Our relationship was generally good, but when Barbara drank, she got angry and crazy. She was the first one to get into a fight. Bruce confirmed what his daughter said. Since the house Mullenixoff was located near Hollywood, Barbara was in an extraordinary delight. She loved movies, especially singled out Gone with the Wind. A short time after the move, the woman managed to get a job as an extra. Hollywood dream come true. She felt that in time she would be offered a more serious role. But for now, together with her daughter, took an active part in the masses in movies and TV shows. The scene of the crime was established. Who is the culprit? Police officers could not understand why none of the relatives did not report the disappearance of the murdered woman. Soon, police officers Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright obtained a search warrant for Barbara's home. They hypothesized that since the woman was wrapped in a sheet, the crime could have occurred in bed. So the search for evidence had to begin at Mrs. Mullenix's residence. The police found no one at Barbara's house. At first glance, everything seemed to be in order. There were no visible signs of a crime. However, in one of the rooms on the second floor, a disassembled bed attracted attention. It was without a mattress. It only took a couple hours to reconstruct the scene. The detectives' assumptions had a real basis. Specialists found traces of blood on the walls. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to get rid of the evidence. The blood-stained mattress had apparently been destroyed. There was no doubt that the crime had taken place in this place. The police also believed that the owner of the house knew the perpetrator. Therefore, the first suspect was Mr. Mullenix. It was a strange coincidence that the man was out of town. In addition, just the day after the body was discovered, Bruce returned home. He explained that he was worried because his wife and daughter were not answering their phone calls. The man, of course, had a premonition of something wrong, but in no way expected to hear such a thing. Nevertheless, the news of Barbara's terrible death, the former spouse took it calmly. This also alerted the detectives, so they began to investigate the reason for his departure. Bruce said he was on a business trip. Mr. Mullenix's management confirmed his alibi. The investigation was back to square one: daughter's love. When Rachel turned 17 years old, she met with Ian Allen. The guy was older than the girl by 4 years. Young people fell madly in love with each other. Ian supported Rachel in everything, even helped with household chores. At first, Barbara liked him. They even spent time together. They went for walks together. They went out together. In order for the lovers to meet freely, Rachel's parents got a special permit. Apparently, so required by law and police officers. Law enforcers often drew attention to the non-standard couple. The girl was allowed to be absent until 1 o'clock in the morning, but she often violated the established schedule, for which she was repeatedly under house arrest. After a while, Mrs. Mullenix noticed that her daughter's feelings were growing into something more. To make matters worse, the two announced that they had decided to get engaged. The move seemed too quick to Barbara. Ian and Rachel had only known each other for 3 months. Barbara didn't want to lose her daughter and the payments she received from her ex-husband. Barbara decided to increase her influence and discipline. Rachel was caught between two fires. She didn't want to offend her mother, whose control was only increasing. Ian, in turn, did not give way. So her mother and Ian began to compete for Rachel's attention. Rachel's fragile psyche suffered with every quarrel and altercation that arose between them. By the end of the summer of 2006, Ian and Barbara's relationship finally deteriorated. The younger Alan was afraid that Rachel's mother would convince her not to date him or forbid her from doing so at all. One day, when Rachel once again violated her schedule for coming home, Barbara exploded. Despite the late hour, Mrs. Mullenix headed to the boyfriend's house and made a scandal. This situation really offended and angered Ian. It became clear to everyone that it couldn't go on like this. On the trail of the fugitives, Bruce was no longer suspected of killing his ex-wife. Detectives turned their attention to Rachel and Ian. Police found out that Barbara had been feeling lonely lately and was drinking a lot. It made her inadequate. Her daughter's attention was slipping away from her. She considered Ian an unworthy companion and Rachel a traitor. That's why Mrs. Mullenix often quarreled with them. Besides, no one knew where the lovers were. They never contacted each other. Given the complicated relationship between Barbara and Ian, the girl's father assumed that Ian was a criminal who was being sought. Rachel, in all likelihood, is not safe either. Otherwise, she would have made herself known, Mr. Mullenix pondered. The police began searching for the missing persons. The Allens' house was also searched. When the detectives checked Ian's computer, they found curious queries on the internet. The guy was researching the route of transportation to the city of Tampa, which is located in Florida. Bruce remembered that before moving in with him, Barbara and Rachel lived there. The couple was reported missing. All police stations in the country received bulletins with a description of the appearance of young people. In addition, the alleged suspect did not disappear without a trace. He left a decent trail behind him. Ian Allen's credit card was used to make a purchase at a gas station in Louisiana. That's also where a surveillance camera captured the guy's truck. Mr. Mullenix's fears were confirmed. Rachel was indeed with him. The only thing left to do was to intercept them. So officers Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright called their colleagues from the next town on the couple's route. Local police shut down highways in search of the van. Ian Allen and Rachel Mullenix were soon caught. The kidnapping story. "Do you know I've been kidnapped?" Rachel shouted when apprehended. "What right did you have to arrest me, to throw me on the ground in handcuffs?" She continued, "I'm not a criminal for you to treat me like this." Detectives Joe and Steve waited for the moment when they could finally question the couple. 2 days later, they arrived at a Louisiana police station. Miss Mullenix insisted that she had not killed her mother. Once investigators pressed the girl, she blamed it on her boyfriend. Rachel claimed that Ian killed her mom and afterwards forced her to run away with him. The police asked for more details about what happened on September 13th, 2006. "I woke up to hear noises in the house. Then I realized that my mother was screaming a lot and calling for help. I rushed to her room. What I saw shocked me. Ian had attacked my mom with a knife. He was stabbing her over and over again. I jumped on him, tried to push him away. He was very strong, so he easily fought me back. I couldn't believe what was happening. I was in a kind of stupor." Rachel began her story. Afterwards, she added that the boyfriend forced her to help cover her tracks. He also insisted that she pack her mother's belongings into bags. Rachel claimed that by doing so, Ian wanted to stage Barbara's unexpected departure. At first, the detectives wanted to believe the girl. The shock she'd been through could send anyone into a state of frustration. But for some reason, the witness to the crime was overly justified. And afterwards, she fiercely insisted that she was not involved in the crime. Furthermore, there were no signs of resistance on Rachel's body. When communicating with Ian Allen, police officers found out an interesting fact. His girlfriend from time to time told about how hard it is for her to live with her mother, how intemperate the woman behaves when she drinks. Instead of reconciling the rivals, Rachel only increased Ian's negative feelings. Certainly some of the facts were true, but some of them were clearly exaggerated. That was why Ian was finally convinced that Barbara would not let them rest. Sometime after the night's quarrel at the Owen house, holding a grudge against Barbara, the lad headed for the Mullenix house. Rachel was under house arrest. I wanted to see her. I knew Barbara wouldn't let me in to see her, so I came secretly. I wanted to sneak into her room quietly, but Barbara spotted me. We got into an argument that escalated into threats. With the folding knife I always carry, I decided to scare her. As soon as the blade was at Mrs. Mullenix's throat, she started screaming. This made me angry and provoked an attack. Things got out of control. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Rachel really had nothing to do with it, Ian said about the incident. To the surprise of the investigators, the guy did not try to avoid responsibility and confess to everything. Over time, detectives became increasingly convinced that Rachel Mullenix was directly involved in the crime. Her boyfriend was clearly covering for her. CCTV footage from the gas station convenience store where the couple had stopped was scrutinized. Rachel was walking around the store looking for groceries. At that point, she could have safely called for help or run away. But for some reason, she didn't. Moreover, as it turned out later, the girl had the opportunity to call her father, but preferred to make a call to her friend. It was found that a couple of hours after the crime, Miss Mullenix sent a message to Ian Allen. "I love you," she wrote in her text. And that's how Rachel finally lost the trust of the investigation. Rachel's defense. It took 2 years to gather and analyze all the evidence in the Barbara Mullenix murder case. During that time, Rachel turned 19 years old. For any other girl, that's a great age. There is a whole life ahead of her. For young Mullenix, her future depended on the jury's verdict, and she tried to convince everyone of her innocence. When Rachel talked about her childhood, her face lit up. It was obvious that the tender years were happily spent. No doubt Barbara and Bruce had tried to make them so, despite many circumstances. Recalling the relationship with her mother, the daughter said that they were good. They were marred only by alcohol, which was abused by the murdered woman and the boyfriend who appeared over time. At school, I was known as a girl from a not very prosperous family with alcoholic parents. When my father drank, he was still himself. He was kind and considerate, which can't be said for my mom. She described the family atmosphere in court. Her words were confirmed by her friend Kelsey Douglas, who often visited the Mullenix family. Kelsey said that Rachel always tried to please her mother in everything. But apparently, there came a point when she could no longer tolerate the harsh control and insults. She admitted to me that she had started drinking from time to time. Rachel didn't know what else to do. She had nowhere else to turn. The alcohol helped relieve tension, to forget for a while about family difficulties, Miss Douglas reported. Alex, Rachel's older brother, strangely enough, also stood up for Rachel. He considered her a victim rather than a murderer. That's why he refused to believe in her guilt to the last. He told the court that his sister had been a good and obedient child. She did well at school, practiced sports and ballet. As for the relationship between Barbara, Rachel, and Ian, Alex noted that at first they were great. All three spent a lot of time together. Barbara's eldest son also reported that their mother abused alcohol and illegal substances before her death. She took stimulants and tranquilizers and often threw loud parties. When Barbara realized that Rachel and her boyfriend wanted to distance themselves, she couldn't accept it. In addition, she found it difficult to get by on her own without alimony and maintenance money. All of this became a source of irritation. According to Alex, Mrs. Mullenix was a very controlling woman. She wanted to be in control of everything. With Rachel, she certainly went overboard in this. My mother loved to be the center of attention. With Ian coming into Rachel's life, her position shifted to the side, Alex summarized. In the involvement of his daughter in the murder of Barbara could not believe and the girl's father. He believed that she loved her mother very much and was incapable of hurting her. In all the time, Rachel did not accuse her mother of the weaknesses that were peculiar to her. She simply reported them as a fact. The girl repeatedly stated that she felt sorry for her. Barbara had a difficult life. About the relationship of her parents, Miss Mullenix recalled with bitterness. Rachel said that the slightest details in the behavior of his father drove his mother into a rage. Barbara often snapped at him, considered a spender. Rachel also told the court that she regretted her love for the young man. She made a big mistake when she started dating him. Their feelings brought discord to her relationship with her mother. Ian felt that my mom was a threat to him. He also wanted to control me like she did. My boyfriend wasn't ideal either. Often hurt and treated me like I was his property. I was torn between the two. Every time there was an argument with my mom, I shared about it. It made it easier for me to get over what happened, Rachel recalled. She concluded by adding that Ian did everything he could to prevent harm to what he thought was his prosecution's position. Sonia Belest, the prosecutor involved in the case, did not believe Rachel's story. She claimed that the girl's angelic appearance was deceptive because she thought she was already smart enough for her age. Therefore, the position Miss Mullenix had chosen was thoroughly refuted. The officers who investigated supported the prosecutor in this. Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright believed that Rachel had some mental health issues. According to them, she was the meanest girl they had ever spoken to. During the interview, the prosecutor competently appealed the inconsistencies in Miss Mullenix's testimony. She inquired of Rachel why she never once called for help when she could have done so, to which the girl replied that she was confused and did not know how to behave in such a situation. The defendant also added that she was frightened by Ian's behavior, which was difficult to predict. The prosecutor drew attention to the fact that Rachel had not a single chance to escape. The girl's actions were atypical for a kidnapped victim. The prosecution believed that Miss Mullenix had not only attacked her mother herself, but had planned the crime in advance. When they tried to ask Rachel about the details of Ian's stabbing, Rachel was unable to answer. Her testimony changed and contradicted each other more than once. During the trial, the defendant stated that she was not present during the argument between Barbara and Ian. Allegedly, she simply left them in her room, hoping they would calm down. Only then did she hear screaming and the sounds of a struggle, after which she came running back and saw that the guy attacked her mom with a knife. However, Rachel's version did not coincide with the evidence that was found at the scene of the crime. The forensic report clearly established that Barbara's attacker was not alone. Specialists estimated that 5 minutes had been enough to kill the woman. Rachel continued to insist on her own innocence. Questions: why she didn't call emergency services, why she wrote a love text to the killer boyfriend, were frozen in the air unanswered. The forensic psychiatrist who worked with Miss Mullenix diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder. He believed she truly loved her mother, but she hated her equally as much. By the way, people with this kind of personality are prone to erratic behavior. It's often destructive to both the unsub and others. Bitter verdict. It took the jury 3 days to reach a final verdict. Ian Allen was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. For Rachel Mullenix, the court's verdict was no consolation either. She was found to be involved in the death of her mother and qualified the act as first-degree murder. The girl was sentenced to life in prison. Her first chance for parole will come when the inmate turns about 41 years old. After the verdict was announced, the prosecutor said she was relieved. There is no question that Ian Allen and Rachel Mullenix killed Barbara, Sonia Balest concluded. For a mother, such a death was a true betrayal. The day Barbara brought her daughter into the world, she signed her own death warrant. The child she loved immensely became her light and darkness at the same time. Undoubtedly, Mrs. Mullenix made many mistakes in her life. She was not an ideal mother, but she never abandoned her children to perdition. Barbara's jealousy and fear of being alone hardened the woman's already strong character. But people in love always have a choice. They could simply leave to preserve their right to their feelings. In time, things would have calmed down. Relationships would have mended. Perhaps Barbara would have switched to something else, and the grandchildren Rachel and Ian would give her would be her outlet. January 1999. David and Belinda Temple were expecting their second child. Belinda was due to give birth as soon as possible. The doctors predicted labor in a couple of weeks. Like all pregnant women, Belinda was tired very much and quickly, and she still had her son Evan, who also required attention and care. That day, David decided to relieve his wife from household chores and gave her some time for an evening rest. And so that she would not be distracted by anything, he and his son went for a walk in the park. Father and son were having fun. Walking in the fresh air quickly tires and whets the appetite, so after the walk, they went to a cafe to eat a sandwich and drink a Coke. After the cafe, they drove home. David parked the car and noticed that the front door of his house had broken glass. "Evan, I'm going to take you to visit Harlan for a bit, okay?" said David, and without waiting for an answer from his son, quickly led him across the street to a neighboring house where family friends lived. "Why can't we go to Mom's?" asked the son, who could barely keep up with his father. "Mom's in the hospital right now." David couldn't think of anything else to say. Quentin Harlan had barely opened the door to the unexpected guests, and not even had time to say hello before David took his son into the living room without speaking and ran toward his house. Quentin, not understanding anything, shouted to his wife to look after the child, and himself ran after his silent friend. "What's the matter?" Quentin shouted, but when he saw the broken front door of Temple's dwelling, he realized that David probably didn't know what was waiting for him inside. The house was a mess. All the closets were open, things were scattered on the floor, and worst of all, there were trails of blood on the floor that led to the stairs. Quentin pushed David aside and saw that under the stairs, in the dressing room, Belinda was lying belly down with her arms spread apart and a huge hole in the back of her head. David, apparently out of shock, did not even cry out, did not utter a word, did not rush to his wife's body, but immediately took out his cell phone and dialed the police number. The operator on the other end of the line didn't anticipate the brutality of the murder, so he asked David to check Belinda's pulse and even give her CPR. "What the hell kind of CPR are you talking about? Her head is splattered all over the walls." Police officers immediately rushed to the scene, except they didn't get inside the house for a long time. The Temple family's bull terrier, named Shaq, growled and barked at the unfamiliar uniformed men and seemed about ready to lunge at the police officers. One of the officers even drew his service pistol as David, who had come out of the house, yelled for them to put their guns away and hurriedly took the aggressive dog into the garage. Once inside the house where the tragedy had recently occurred, the police looked around and concluded that the burglars were at work here, who did not know that the mistress was in the house at that moment, and even though she was pregnant, they had no choice but to shoot her and thus get rid of the witness. 1986. Belinda gets a college education in her hometown, even though her twin sister Brenda left to study at Steve Austin University. Belinda stayed with her parents because in high school, she started dating Marshall Kelmy, who was 3 years older than her and whom she was just crazy about. Her father and mother were against this relationship, at least because of her boyfriend, their daughter would not be able to get a prestigious education and, as it usually happens, would get pregnant early and end up dropping out of even a community college. On this topic, there were many scandals in their home. Carol's mother did not allow her daughter to start a joint life with Marshall and dropped then such a phrase, "He is nobody to you. When you get married, you can move out anywhere, but until then, you have your own house." Belinda was a stubborn girl who always got her way, and she must have taken her mother's words as a wake-up call. Sometime later, at a family dinner, to which Marshall had been invited, despite the inhibitions, the young couple announced that they were to be married. There was a heavy silence at the table. Well, now that they've decided, Mom gritted her teeth, and they spent the rest of the evening in complete silence. Belinda had actually made the decision herself, wanting to show her parents that she was an adult and capable of making her own decisions. Her boyfriend was not particularly eager for an official marriage, but did not refuse the proposal of his girlfriend, whether he did not want to offend or for some other reason. The two young people got married. No, there was no grand celebration. Belinda wore her sister's white dress, called a few friends, and she and Marshall signed, and then just walked around the city, drinking champagne and having fun. The very next day, Belinda packed her things and moved in with her husband, who at that time still lived with his parents, and rent a separate place was not even planned. Official marriage, in fact, did not affect their relationship, and as already mentioned, Belinda did it all just to stop hearing motherly reproaches and become independent. But the taste of this life turned out to be very bitter. Not 6 months later, Marshall began to spend little time at home, saying he was working late, but was actually with another woman. Belinda found out when she noticed that her husband was acting strangely. One day she waited until his workday was over and followed her husband, and that's when it all came to light. Marshall was walking hand in hand with some strange woman, most likely with his colleague. The deceived wife did not organize any fights and jealousy scenes, but simply packed her things and returned to her mother. The guilty Marshall hung around the doorstep of her house for a long time, often calling on the phone, trying to beg her forgiveness, but Belinda was unshakable and too proud to forgive the young man. They were soon divorced. 1998. Belinda is already pregnant with her second child, but still works part-time at the school. The children listen to her half-heartedly, respect her for her fairness, and even a little afraid. Belinda herself is worried that because of her pregnancy, she will miss the basketball competition between schools, and she will not be able to prepare the team well, because her colleague, Richard Bachman, does not care about her team and children in general. He has confessed to her so many times that if he had another job, he would have given up being a teacher long ago. Belinda disliked this attitude and could not understand how this flabby and fat 40-year-old man was still in his position. Belinda was not one of those teachers who turned a blind eye to student absenteeism. So when she noticed that one of her students, high school senior Riley Joe Sanders, had been absent from class for months, she immediately reached out to her colleagues. She wanted to know if this was her problem as a teacher or if the boy was a systematic truant. Her colleagues answered that it was not her problem. The boy was brought up in a bad family. No one cared about him, and he appeared at school only rarely. Belinda couldn't leave it at that. That same evening, she visited his mother, who lived nearby, and had a serious talk with her, which later bore fruit. However, it wasn't quite what the young teacher had expected. Riley Joe Sanders came to class, practiced on an equal footing with the other students, but during a basketball game, when Sanders pushed his opponent and Belinda pointed out Riley's disgusting behavior, he insulted her with the last words and even said something like, "You'll answer to me for this. You better look around, especially in the evenings." 1987. After breaking up with Marshall, Belinda had nothing left to hold on to in her hometown. So she followed her sister to Stephen F. Austin State University. She loved her time at the university. It seems that she truly found her calling. In addition to studying, she works part-time as a basketball coach, and the young woman had high expectations. At the same university, she meets David Temple. He, like Belinda, is a part-time coach, but for soccer, and also plays for the university team as team captain. Soccer for David was an integral part of life. He practiced it since childhood, and even then it was clear that he would become a star. At school, he always successfully played for his team, for which he was respected by all teachers, even though David had a difficult character. He could easily insult anyone or even beat up, but he got away with it all. Being on the field during the game, he would start with half a turn, and then could not calm down for a very long time. Later, however, one of the players on his team said that David's aggressiveness is due to the fact that he takes steroids. With Belinda, David behaved completely differently, turned into a caring guy who literally could carry his queen in his arms. With one amendment, as soon as someone smiled in the direction of his beloved, as David immediately turned on and tried to clarify the relationship on the fists. Belinda also came to the taste, and David's parents, they literally idolized her. They really liked that she, as well as their son, crazy about sports, which means they have a lot in common. But her twin sister, and in principle Belinda's friends, from this union were, to put it mildly, not thrilled. The whole point is that before meeting David, they knew Belinda as a strong-willed and independent personality, and in this relationship, she changed a lot, became constrained, quiet, humble. It seemed that her whole life was built around pleasing David. In addition to all of this, being in this toxic relationship, Belinda became distant from her family. Calls to her parents became less and less frequent, and trips home, whether for vacations or weekends, stopped altogether. Who in the family could like this? Closer to graduation, the couple got themselves a bull terrier and named their pet Shaq. And after receiving their long-awaited diplomas, David and Belinda got married. 1999. The police began to examine the crime scene. How could the burglar get into a house guarded by such a vicious dog? In fact, how could the perpetrator distract the bull terrier that prevented the police from making a step into the Temple yard? Then they turned their attention to the front door. The glass was broken, as if the perpetrator had tried to open the lock from the inside, but in that case, the shards of glass would have been near the threshold. But here they were in the distance, to the right of the entrance. So the glass was broken when the door was unlocked. Why would they do that? In the living room, there was a box on a nightstand, with a toppled TV lying on the floor beside it. The policeman opened it. Inside lay earrings, rings, a chain, in appearance resembling gold. Also not clear why the robber did not touch the jewelry. With each new minute spent inside the Temple family home, the police officers came more and more to the conclusion that everything that had happened inside resembled a dramatization. They knew from experience that in a robbery, the criminal takes absolutely everything he can find and carry away. And here, as it seems, nothing was even taken. And then there was that dog that wouldn't leave their minds. Something was clearly wrong here. As for the murder, the shot was fired in the back of the head, presumably with a 12-gauge shotgun, while the victim was kneeling with his back to the killer. That said, a shotgun is not considered a popular weapon among robbers. It's very difficult to carry or transport and still not be seen. In Belinda's case, the murder was absolutely 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A criminal wouldn't be walking around with a shotgun in broad daylight. David, do you keep any weapons at home? Yeah, I have a couple of rifles. David showed his weapons to the police officers, but the shotgun that could have killed Belinda was not among them. The cops asked David to ride with them to the station to give a statement and take an inventory of the stolen items. The man was very nervous, but nevertheless went with the police officers. His son Evan, who did not yet know what had happened, stayed at Harlan's house. 1996. David Temple and Quentin Harlan, in addition to being neighbors, worked at the same school. You could say that they were real friends. They often met outside of work hours to watch games on TV together or have a family barbecue. One day, David and Quentin were brought together by something else besides their love of sports. There was a new young teacher at the school, Heather Scott. Quentin immediately paid attention to her, gave all sorts of signs of attention, and one day even invited her to an evening dinner, but Heather refused him. It so happened that Quentin had a rival, and this rival, surprisingly, turned out to be David. Quentin was beyond angry and resentful that his married friend, who even has a son, was building a secret relationship at work. You have to hand it to Quentin. He was a good friend and could keep a secret. Heather did not even suspect about David's marital status, since he did not wear a wedding ring and did not tell anything about his real life. Moreover, outside the walls of the school, David and Heather behaved like a happy couple, and it was noticed by the whole teaching staff of the school. Belinda knew nothing about David's second life. Once she talked to Quentin and revealed to him that she suspected her husband of cheating, but Quentin, of course, dissuaded the suffering wife. You have a vivid imagination. David is your husband and a great family man. How could you think such a thing? And there was much to think about. If David had previously been extremely reverent towards Belinda, now he could afford to insult his wife even in front of other people, such as, for example, he often called her fat, although after childbirth she only a little weight gain, asked to go to another room when there were guests in the house, as if she scares them with her untidy appearance, and so on. Belinda, instead of having a serious talk with her husband on the subject, accepted this attitude toward herself, but cried at night and felt deeply unhappy as a woman. In parallel, all the while, David was enjoying his new relationship with Heather. 1999. The police suspected David, but they couldn't prove anything. But flipping through the case files of burglaries in the neighborhood, they learned that 8 days before the murder at the Temple house, a house on the next street had been burglarized, and the perpetrator was Riley Joe Sanders. Yes, the same persistent truant from the school where Belinda taught and who had threatened her. He was immediately called in for questioning. Riley had no alibi on the day of the murder, and besides, his father had a shotgun, just a 12 gauge. But when they searched the Sanders house, no weapon was found. When the high school student realized that the police had every reason to detain him, he confessed that on the day of the murder of the teacher, he was with friends, and hid it only because he was with a large group of people smoking pot and did not want to frame others with his testimony. The charge against Riley was dropped. 1998. Because of a new relationship with a coworker, David became further and further estranged from his family. His psychological pressure on his wife grew steadily. He never once raised his hand at her, but all their communication consisted only of insults. It was during this year that Belinda learned that she was pregnant again. This news made her forget about all the past offenses against David, and she felt over the moon. David seemed to be trying to act like a happy father too, but it wasn't working. Sometimes David did not even come home at night, and Belinda was afraid to ask what was the reason for his absence at night, because her husband could get very angry and make a real scandal. A pregnant woman did not want that. Belinda often asked David to help her prepare for the birth of the baby, to go to the store for things, to make repairs in the new children's room, to install shelves on the walls. David ignored all of his wife's requests, and Belinda, although she was in a position, began to do everything on her own, to go shopping, paint the walls, assemble the purchased furniture. David made no effort at all. Christmas was coming. Belinda was already 8 months pregnant. She decided to discuss with her husband what they would give each other, but David suggested that they should not give gifts together this year, and that the money saved would be better spent on the baby that was about to be born, especially since the doctors had warned the expectant mother that she might go into premature labor and the baby might be born before the new year. Christmas came. Although the spouses had agreed not to give each other anything, David never gave Belinda anything, not even a nice little thing. Moreover, he suddenly packed his things and said that all the New Year's holidays will spend with friends on the hunt. Belinda told her sister about it, and she dropped all her plans to come to her so that Belinda would not feel abandoned. And as the doctors warned, labor could begin at any moment. David, of course, wasn't on any hunting trips with his friends. He spent the holidays with Heather, whose neck was decorated with a gold necklace, a gift from Temple for Christmas. 2007. It seemed that David Temple has almost forgotten about the murder of his wife, as if in his life no Belinda Temple had never been. He did not care about the fact that from the moment of the murder has passed 5 years and the culprit has not been found. He married Heather in 2001, and the two of them raised Evan, but back in 2004. In November, there was a knock on his door. On the doorstep stood police officers who, handcuffing David, informed him that he was being held on suspicion of the murder of Belinda Temple. David, as before, denied everything. David's trial did not begin until 2007. According to the investigation, the motive for the crime was his new love affair with Heather. Interviewed colleagues of David said that more than once during Belinda's pregnancy, heard him bragging about how he easily exchanged his fat and pregnant wife for a young and beautiful Heather. According to the prosecution's version, David killed Belinda immediately after she came home from work because the young woman was found in her work uniform and work shoes. He then initiated the robbery by throwing things around the house and quickly drove to the park with his son, which provided an alibi. The prosecution also added such facts that nothing was stolen from the house, and there was a vicious dog in the yard that would not let any stranger into the house. The murder weapon was probably dropped by David in the rice paddy, as there were witnesses who saw David's car stopped near the paddy and only Evan was in the car at the time. However, the shotgun was never recovered in that area. Heather's testimony was that before the murder of Belinda, their relationship with David was not considered serious, and she did not even love him. These words Temple certainly did not like and introduced confusion into the jury's decision. Could David kill his wife for the sake of a non-serious relationship, or Heather is lying, trying to save her husband in this way? In November 2007, David was sentenced to life in prison. 2009. A friend of Riley Sanders goes to the police to clear his conscience. From his words then, a few years ago, Riley told him how he took his father's shotgun with the intention of robbing the Temple family home, and thereby teaching his teacher a lesson about his mother's truancy at school. And he really almost managed to enter the house, but at that moment, a bull terrier ran out of the garage, and Riley shot at the dog, but did not hit, and afraid that the sound of shotgun fire would attract the neighbors, quickly ran away from there. This testimony was submitted to the court. A review of the case began. In the meantime, David was released from prison on bail. Heather had no intention of being the wife of a man who had spent so much time in jail and was not sure how much longer he would spend in jail. She filed for divorce. It took the jury a long time to decide what kind of punishment David deserved. It was when Temple was free, and the court had not yet decided his sentence that the pandemic began. It wasn't until 2023 that the case was revisited. David was found guilty after all. He was sentenced to life in prison with parole after 17 years. His son Evan, while the trial was going on until the last moment, did not believe that his father was capable of such a cold-blooded murder, and throughout the trial, supported him to the last moment.